It would appear from the Chinese annals that the Cambodians at an early period were an exceedingly warlike race, and that they annexed many surrounding kingdoms. Thus, in the history of the Sung dynasty, there's a reference to the kingdom of Sanbotsi. That country is there described as coterminous with Cochin China, Changcheng, and lying between Cambodia, Chinla, and Java. It is further represented as highly civilized, owning both Hindu and Chinese institutions, and making use of Chinese state documents. Lastly, we are told that the education of the country was conducted by means of Pali writing. In the year AD 1003, it is stated that the reigning monarch sent an embassy to inform the Emperor of China that he was building a Buddhist temple in the hope that so meritorious a work might add something to the length of his years. The edifice referred to might have been Nakhon Wat, but evidence from other quarters points to a later date for its construction. It would appear to have been built after the visit of the Chinese traveler of the 13th century, whose narrative M. Remusat has translated. As he makes no mention of it, he visited Cambodia in 1295, but the final overthrow of the empire by the Siamese did not take place until 1373, when the still unfinished temple was abandoned and the king fled to Annam. Nakhon Wat itself bears evidence that during the progress of its construction, the Cambodian empire must have been overthrown by some crushing disaster. At any rate, the building was never finished, and in the interior of an outer pavilion I found some pillars which were still rough-hewn. They had been placed in position, it is true, but we could almost point out the spot at which the sculptor's hand had been arrested, leaving his task forever incomplete. The plan followed had been to fit the rough monolithic stones into their places, and then to cover them with sculptures, a system adopted nowadays by our own builders when elaborate ornaments have to be carved. But I must quit a subject over which I fain would linger and hurry forward on my journey. We spent several days at the ruined city of Nakhon, on the verge of the native jungle, and amidst a forest of magnificent trees. Here we were surrounded on every side by ruins as multitudinous as they were gigantic. One building alone covered an area of vast extent, and was crowned with 51 stone towers. Each tower was sculptured to represent a four-faced Buddha, or Brahma, and thus 204 colossal sphinx-like countenances gazed benignly towards the cardinal points, all full of that expression of purity and repose which Buddhists so love to portray, and all wearing diadems of the most chaste design above their unruffled stony brows. At the outer gate of this city, I experienced a sort of modern battle of the apes. Reared high above the gateway stood a series of subordinate towers, having a single larger one in their center, whose apex again displayed to us the four benign faces of the ancient god. The image was partly concealed beneath parasitic plants which twined their clustering fibers in a rude garland around the now neglected head. When I attempted to photograph this object, a tribe of black apes wearing white beards came hooting along the branches of the overhanging trees, swinging and shaking the boughs so as to render my success impossible. A party of French sailors who were assisting the late Captain de Lagre in his researches into the Cambodian ruins came up opportunely and sent a volley among my mischievous opponents, whereupon they disappeared with what haste they might and fled away till their monkey jargon was lost in the recesses of the forest. On our return to Siam Reap, we found our old friend the Chow Muang busily engaged in the cremation services of the deputy governor who had deceased not long before. The funeral pyre was set beneath an imposing catafalque, with a spire that reminded us of some Gothic church. A pavilion had also been erected to accommodate the spectators, of whom there were 200 or thereabouts. The ceremony began with a procession of Buddhist priests, behind whom followed a band of musicians, a troop of hired mourners bringing up the rear. These mourners kept to their work bravely, the chief leading off with a shrill wail, and his associates supporting him with a chorus of sobs. While the body was still burning, the townsfolk gave themselves up to the delights of a banquet, or occupied their time with the theatricals and a variety of other amusements which had been provided for their entertainment, but gambling was the pastime most in vogue. The comic evolutions of a dwarf and a giant were received with general approbation, while a troop of pretty Lacan girls who danced to native music came in also to show that the burning of the body of a chief was by no means a subject to call forth intense mourning, any more than the burning of a house would with us, when one felt certain that the owners were safe and their effects insured. The deceased chief, they supposed, had gone, leaving behind nothing more than his old tenement of clay, that in his future state he might take possession of one better fitted for a being 1 degree nearer nirvana. The only objection to the practice of cremation in our own Christian country that can be reasonably urged is the feeling that the relatives of deceased persons would be sanctioning or taking part in what to them might seem to be a barbarous destruction of familiar and much-loved forms in place of consigning them to the silent, slow, but equally certain and more loathsome process of decomposition in the grave. Some again would ask, what if our real bodies are one day to be raised up from the dead? Putting no faith in the theory that the dust of the dead mixes with its parent soil and is constantly being redistributed among living plants and animals, and that the gases of the body pass into the air and are carried with the wind over the wide world. Such persons would thus seek to limit the power of the Almighty by supposing that the process of cremation would in some way affect the ultimate designs of God, but this is a subject on which I cannot enter here. It seems to me, however, that no valid objections can be raised to cremation as a rapid means of disposing of the bodies of the dead in overcrowded cities, in the neighborhood of which extensive and overstocked burial grounds have proved detrimental to the health of the community. Next day, we mounted our elephants and started for the Richie Mountains about 30 miles distant from Siem Reap. It is said that these mountains contain the quarries from which the ancient Cambodians obtained their supplies of stone. On our route, we passed more ruins, the most remarkable being a broad causeway which led right up to the foot of the hills and which was still in very serviceable repair. The officer who accompanied us made a series of devout offerings at the shrines in the forests in order to gain the favor of the malignant spirits that infest these wilds. We then set out barebacked upon the elephants to attempt to penetrate the thick jungle of the mountains. But riding barebacked upon an elephant was by no means as agreeable as it was new to us. The loose skin on the back had a nasty way of carrying one over the hard spine of the animal. However, there was nothing for it but to submit and push on, as howdahs could not be used, and we soon discovered that even the elephants themselves could not make way through the gigantic wall of jungle and forest that closed us round on all sides. We had therefore to return, but not before seeing what we imagined to be traces of ancient stone quarries. The expedition occupied nearly 3 days, after which we pushed on for the head of the Talisapp Lake. This lake rises during the rains to a very considerable depth and forms a sort of backwater to the river Mekong. But when we crossed it, which it took us about 5 days to do, we found that the water was seldom more than 3 or 4 feet deep, whereas at the end of the wet season it becomes so full that even the forests on its banks are submerged. A number of fishermen's villages studded the lake, some of them far from the shores and supported on piles which had been driven into the soft bottom of the lake. These villages, from their situation and general appearance, reminded me of the accounts given of the prehistoric lake dwellings of Switzerland. The houses are erected above a platform of bamboo, common to the entire settlement, and used also for drying and curing fish. After descending Talisapp and entering the stream that connects it with the Mekong, we discovered that a great trade in fish oil was carried on in the enemy's settlements along the banks. It surprised us to see the enormous quantities of fish that were caught in this lake and then sent to the enemy's villages to be boiled down into oil. The trade is a lucrative one and gives employment to thousands of families, the only really industrious ones in this quarter. We came into contact with European civilization once more when a sudden bend of the stream brought us in sight of a small gunboat, which was there awaiting the return of M. de la Grey from Siem Reap. The meeting was as welcome as it was unexpected, and I shall be ever grateful to those kindly French officers for cordially receiving us on board. On March 26th, we landed at Kampong Luang, the first trading place of any pretensions which we had yet reached on our downward voyage. There are many Malays settled in this town, as might be expected from the name it bears. Malay settlements indeed are common on both banks of the stream, but regarding the date at which they came into the country, the village chiefs whom I interrogated could give no certain information. They adhere to their own customs, are governed by their own chiefs, and are followers of the Mohammedan religion. The bazaar at Kampong Luang presented a most animated scene, and we saw few there who were not well dressed and busy, and to all appearance prosperous. We reached Phnom Penh on the night of the 27th, and anchored off the palace in the center of the town. Just below this place there is a point at which several streams converge. Of these confluents, the most important is the great river Mekong, and after that, the artery which drains the lake at one season and fills it at another, and down which we had been shaping our course. The king treated us with great courtesy, assigning us a house within the palace grounds, and entertaining us repeatedly at his table, where excellent dinners were specially prepared for us in completely European style. The fact is, His Majesty had a French cook in his pay, and this was the secret of a culinary skill which at first took us somewhat by surprise. These dinners were a real enjoyment, for we had not had a good meal for some time, as my readers will understand when I tell them that at Nakhon Wat, thinking we should be all the better for some strengthening food, and not being familiar with the American plan of cutting a steak as we required it and keeping the animal going alive, we had to purchase a whole bullock to secure a joint of beef. The animal afforded us about 3 good meals and caused us to be looked upon as demons by the devout Buddhists for slaying an ox. We then tried to preserve portions of the carcass, but it was a failure. His Majesty honored us with a long performance of his dancing women. However, it was truly a tedious affair when the first novelty of the exhibition had worn off. As for the king, he lay stretched out in a nearly nude condition, betel chewing and smoking till the whole entertainment came to an end. Truly, the cares of state must sit easily on his royal breast. In return for a number of presents we laid at the feet of this easygoing potentate, he one morning sent us a whole pig. He must have done this without consulting the members of his cabinet, for otherwise a monarch so enlightened would hardly have been guilty of so inconsiderate an act. The sight was too much for our way-worn Chinamen. Here was an entire fat porker all our own, handed over to us as a free gift. Their masters would not eat of it, and that they well knew. Almost mechanically they stripped their jackets off and whetted their knives, stopping every now and then to gaze and grin and smack their lips in a sort of delirium of joy. After 3 days of uninterrupted feasting, there was very little left of the pig, but our celestial serving men made a touching appeal to us to pay them their dues, and suffer them to remain behind in a country where pigs are given away. I photographed the king in his native robes of state, and a second time in the uniform of a French field marshal. In the latter instance, I remember there was some difficulty about the boots, which I think ended in His Majesty borrowing a pair from his cook.